Have you ever experienced that electrifying moment when someone thinks they've completely destroyed you, but you're actually holding all the cards? When I heard my husband Derek call me worthless at his family's elaborate dinner party in their Maplewood estate, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I did something that would haunt him forever. I smiled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled because while he was busy humiliating me in front of his prestigious family, I had just received a text message that would change everything. The message that confirmed what I'd been working on in secret for the past 6 months. The message that meant I was about to walk out of that mansion and into a life he could never have imagined I was capable of building. You see, while Derek thought he married a simple, small-town girl who should be grateful for his family's acceptance, he had no idea who he was really dealing with. As I stood up from that mahogany dining table, with 12 pairs of judgmental eyes watching me, I looked directly at my mother-in-law Constance, the woman who had orchestrated this public humiliation, and said just 5 words that would echo through their social circles for months. "Thank you for freeing me tonight." But let me start from the very beginning, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about discovering your own worth when everyone around you has convinced you that you have none. Before we dive into this incredible journey of transformation, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because this story has reached people from every corner of the world, and it touches something universal in all of us. And if this resonates with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or undervalued, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something even more powerful to share with you. A story that will show you exactly how to turn your greatest weakness into your most devastating strength. My name is Amelia Rivers, though back then everyone knew me as Mrs. Derek Ashworth. I grew up in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, where my father ran a local hardware store and my mother taught elementary school. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we were rich in the values that truly matter: integrity, hard work, and the belief that your worth isn't determined by your bank account or your last name. I was the first person in my family to attend college, earning a scholarship to study business at Colorado State University. While my classmates were networking at sorority parties, I was working 3 part-time jobs to pay for books and living expenses. It was during my junior year that I discovered I had an unusual talent. I could look at struggling small businesses and see exactly what they needed to become profitable. What started as helping local shop owners with their marketing strategies soon evolved into something much bigger. By the time I graduated, I had already helped 6 local businesses triple their revenue using social media strategies and digital marketing techniques that were just emerging at the time. But instead of moving to Denver or San Francisco to pursue my career, I made what everyone called a mistake. I followed Derek Ashworth to his hometown of Ridgemont, Connecticut. Derek was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: handsome, charming, from a family with a name that opened doors. He had swept me off my feet during my senior year when he came to give a guest lecture on traditional business values in modern commerce. He represented stability, sophistication, a world I had only seen in movies. When he proposed after 6 months of long-distance dating, I said yes, without hesitation. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't just marrying Derek. I was marrying into the Ashworth legacy, complete with its suffocating expectations, unspoken rules, and a family matriarch who viewed me as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent addition. The Ashworth family had built their fortune in textile manufacturing 3 generations ago, and they lived in Ridgemont like feudal lords overseeing their domain. Their estate sat on 12 acres overlooking the Connecticut River, with gardens that required a full-time staff and a wine cellar that cost more than most people's houses. Derek's mother, Constance Ashworth, ruled this empire with an iron fist wrapped in designer gloves, and she made it clear from our first meeting that she considered her son's choice in wives to be his first major failure in judgment. Derek's father, Harrison, was a quieter man who seemed to have given up having opinions of his own somewhere around his 20th wedding anniversary. Derek's sister Penelope had married into old Boston money and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about her social connections. His brother Camden worked in the family business but spent most of his time at their exclusive country club, maintaining the image of success rather than actually achieving it. The first 3 years of my marriage, I tried desperately to fit into their world. I attended their charity galas wearing dresses that cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage. I learned which fork to use for each course and how to make conversation about topics I found insufferably boring. I smiled through Constance's constant corrections of my grammar, my posture, my choice of conversation topics. I even let her redecorate our home because my rustic Colorado sensibilities were charming but inappropriate for entertaining. What the Ashworth family never bothered to learn about me was that while I was playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law, I was also quietly building something extraordinary. Those same skills I had used to help small businesses in college, I had been applying them on a much larger scale. While Derek thought I was spending my days shopping and having lunch with the other wives, I was actually building a digital empire that would soon make their textile fortune look like pocket change. But they would only discover that truth after Derek made the biggest mistake of his life, the mistake that would set me free and give me the power to show them exactly who they had been underestimating all along. The night that everything changed started like every other monthly Ashworth family dinner. Constance had outdone herself with the guest list. Influential business leaders, old family friends, people whose approval she craved like oxygen. The conversation flowed between topics designed to showcase the family's connections and intelligence, carefully orchestrated to remind everyone present of their place in Ridgemont's social hierarchy. But this particular evening, something was different. This evening I had received a message that would change not just my life, but the entire balance of power in that room. As Derek raised his wineglass to deliver what would become his final insult to me, I was already planning my exit strategy and my entrance into a future none of them could have imagined was possible. The woman they thought they knew was about to disappear forever, and in her place would emerge someone who would make them question everything they believed about power, worth, and who really holds the cards in this game we call life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to take you back to where this all began, because understanding my journey is crucial to understanding how that single text message would become the key to my freedom. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Colorado, population 3,847, taught me lessons that no amount of Ashworth money could ever buy. My father, Robert Rivers, had inherited Rivers Hardware from his father, and despite big box stores threatening small businesses everywhere, he managed to keep our family store thriving through sheer determination and genuine care for his customers. He knew every farmer within 50 miles by name, remembered their wives' birthdays, and somehow always had exactly the part they needed in stock. My mother, Sarah Rivers, was the kind of elementary school teacher who stayed after hours to help struggling students and spent her own money on classroom supplies. She taught me that real wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the impact you had on people's lives. Both my parents worked 16-hour days, not because they had to, but because they understood that building something meaningful required sacrifice. I was what people called a scholarship kid, the girl who made honor roll every semester, not because learning came easily, but because failure wasn't an option when your parents were already working 2 jobs to help pay for what the scholarship didn't cover. While my high school classmates were worried about prom dresses and weekend parties, I was tutoring younger students for gas money and working weekends at the local diner to save for college expenses. Colorado State University felt like stepping into an alien world. Students casually talked about spring break trips to Europe, while I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries that month. But instead of feeling bitter about the inequality, I became fascinated by it. I watched how money moved, how businesses operated, and most importantly, how small changes in strategy could create massive differences in results. My breakthrough came during sophomore year, when I noticed that several local businesses near campus were struggling despite being in high-traffic areas. While my business professors were teaching us theoretical models, I was seeing real-world problems that needed practical solutions. The coffee shop that was losing customers to a chain store down the street, the bookstore that couldn't compete with online retailers, the family restaurant that had amazing food but no one knew about it. I started offering to help these businesses for free, just to test theories I was learning in class. What I discovered was that most small business owners were incredibly talented at their craft, but had no idea how to market themselves in the digital age. They were trying to compete using 1990s strategies in a 2010s world. My first real success was with Rosa's Kitchen, a Mexican restaurant run by a family who had immigrated from Guadalajara 20 years earlier. Rosa made the most incredible mole sauce I had ever tasted, but the restaurant was almost empty every night because people simply didn't know it existed. I convinced Rosa to let me manage her social media presence and created a simple strategy: post one mouth-watering photo of her food every day at 5 p.m., right when people were deciding what to have for dinner. Within 3 months, Rosa's Kitchen went from serving 12 customers a night to having a waiting list on weekends. The local food blogger discovered Rosa's amazing mole sauce and wrote a review that brought food lovers from Denver. Rosa was so grateful that she insisted on paying me, even though I had initially offered to help for free. Word spread quickly in our small college town. Soon I had 6 different businesses asking for my help. I was still maintaining my scholarship GPA and working my other part-time jobs, but I had discovered something that didn't feel like work. It felt like solving puzzles. Each business was a unique challenge that required understanding not just marketing, but psychology, community dynamics, and human behavior. By my junior year, I was earning more from my hobby of helping local businesses than I was from my traditional part-time jobs. But more importantly, I was developing an intuitive understanding of how to identify what people wanted before they even knew they wanted it. This skill would later become the foundation of everything I built. That's when Derek Ashworth entered my life like a character from a movie I had only dreamed of watching. He arrived at Colorado State as a guest lecturer for our Entrepreneurship in Practice course, representing the 3rd generation of Ashworth textiles. At 28, he was only 4 years older than me, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. His presentation was polished, his suit was perfectly tailored, and when he spoke about sustainable business practices and family legacy, I found myself imagining what it would be like to be part of something that had existed for generations. After his lecture, he lingered to answer questions, and I found myself staying behind to ask about his family's transition from traditional manufacturing to modern retail partnerships. What I intended as an academic question turned into a 2-hour conversation over coffee, where Derek seemed genuinely fascinated by my work with local businesses. "You have something that can't be taught," he told me, leaning forward across our small table at the campus coffee shop. "You understand people. That's the missing piece in most business equations." For a girl who had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider looking in, Derek's attention was intoxicating. He represented everything I had never had: stability, social connections, a family name that meant something. When he asked for my number, I felt like Cinderella being invited to the ball. Our relationship unfolded like a fairy tale over the next 8 months. Derek would drive 3 hours from Ridgemont to spend weekends with me, always arriving with thoughtful gifts and stories about the sophisticated world he came from. He took me to restaurants where I had to Google the menu beforehand just to understand what I was ordering. He introduced me to wine that cost more per bottle than I typically spent on groceries in a month. Most importantly, he He seemed genuinely impressed by my business instincts. He would listen intently as I described my strategies for helping local businesses, asking insightful questions and offering connections that could help my clients reach larger markets. When I mentioned that one of my restaurant clients was struggling to source authentic ingredients, Derek connected them with a specialty distributor his family's business had worked with for years. "You're going to change the business world," he told me one evening as we walked through downtown Fort Collins. "You just need the right platform to do it from." When Derek proposed during my senior year, presenting me with a ring that probably cost more than my parents' annual income, I said yes, without hesitation. I was in love, yes, but I was also in love with the idea of what our combined talents could accomplish. Derek had the connections and resources. I had the vision and drive. Together we could build something extraordinary. What I didn't understand then was that Derek's family had very different ideas about what role I would play in their dynasty. They weren't looking for a partner who could contribute to their legacy. They were looking for someone who could be molded to fit into it. The first hint of what I was really walking into came during my initial visit to the Ashworth estate in Ridgemont. Constance Ashworth greeted me at the front door of their mansion wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were evaluating every detail of my appearance with the precision of an appraiser examining a potentially valuable but suspicious antique. "Derek has told us so much about you," she said, her voice carrying just enough emphasis on so much to suggest that quantity had been a concern. "We're simply dying to get to know the young woman who has captured our son's attention so completely." The weekend that followed was a masterclass in subtle intimidation. Every conversation was a test I didn't know I was taking. Every meal was an opportunity to demonstrate how much I didn't know about their world. By Sunday evening, I felt like I had been interviewed for a position I wasn't qualified for and hadn't gotten. But Derek assured me that his family's initial reserve was normal. "They're protective," he explained as we drove back to Colorado. "Once they get to know you, they'll love you as much as I do." I believed him because I wanted to believe him, and because I was about to discover that sometimes the most important lessons in life come from the people who underestimate you most completely. The woman who graduated from Colorado State University that spring and prepared to move to Connecticut was still the same small-town girl who believed that hard work and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. She had no idea that she was about to enter a world where those values would be tested in ways she never could have imagined. But she also had no idea that the skills she had developed helping small businesses succeed would soon become the foundation for something much bigger. Something that would eventually give her the power to walk away from anyone who dared to call her worthless. Moving to Ridgemont, Connecticut felt like stepping into a perfectly curated magazine spread where I was the one element that didn't quite belong. Derek had arranged for us to live in the guest house on his family's estate while we, quote, settled. Which really meant while Constance determined whether I was trainable enough to eventually be allowed into the main house as a proper Ashworth wife. The guest house, though smaller than the main mansion, was still larger than any home I had ever lived in. It came fully furnished with antiques that Derek casually mentioned had been in his family for generations, as if sleeping in a bed that George Washington might have once used was just another Tuesday for him. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and completely impersonal, like living in a museum where you were afraid to touch anything. During those first few months, I threw myself into trying to become the woman Derek's family expected me to be. I enrolled in French lessons because Constance mentioned that cultured women should speak at least 2 languages fluently. I hired a personal trainer because maintaining one's figure was essential for representing the family well at social events. I even took etiquette classes from a woman who charged $300 an hour to teach me the difference between a cocktail fork and a dessert fork. But late at night, when Derek was attending business dinners that wives weren't invited to, I found myself gravitating back to what had always felt natural, helping businesses solve problems. It started innocently enough. I was having lunch at a small cafe in downtown Ridgemont when I overheard the owner, An elderly Italian woman named Francesca, talking to her daughter about how their family restaurant was struggling to compete with the chain establishments that had recently opened in the area. The conversation reminded me so much of the challenges I had helped solve back in Colorado that I couldn't resist introducing myself. Francesca's Bistro had been a Ridgemont institution for 30 years, but their customer base was aging, and younger diners were choosing flashier, more modern restaurants. The food was exceptional. Francesca had learned to cook from her grandmother in Tuscany, but the restaurant felt frozen in time, like it was afraid to change anything and risk losing its identity. I spent an afternoon walking through the restaurant with Francesca, asking questions about her busiest times, her most popular dishes, and her dreams for the business. What I discovered was that she had incredible stories about each recipe, fascinating connections to her family's history in Italy, and a passion for cooking that was absolutely infectious when you got her talking. People don't just want food, I explained to her over espresso that was better than anything I had tasted in any upscale establishment. They want an experience, a story, a connection. You have all of that. You just need to share it. With Francesca's permission, I created a simple social media strategy that focused on storytelling rather than just food photos. We posted videos of Francesca explaining the history behind her grandmother's ragu recipe. We shared photos of the handwritten recipe cards that had been passed down through her family. We created a Sunday supper series where customers could reserve seats at a communal table and hear Francesca tell stories about Italian traditions while they ate. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Food bloggers from Hartford and New Haven started making special trips to Ridgemont just to experience Francesca's storytelling dinners. The local newspaper wrote a feature about the restaurant's quote, authentic Italian experience. And suddenly, Francesca had a waiting list for her Sunday suppers that stretched 3 months out. But more importantly, I had remembered who I was underneath all the etiquette lessons and French vocabulary. Word spread quickly through Ridgemont's small business community. The owner of the struggling bookstore approached me at the farmer's market. The woman who ran the vintage clothing boutique mentioned she'd heard I might be able to help her compete with online retailers. Even the manager of the historic inn that was losing guests to modern hotel chains asked if we could meet for coffee. Within 6 months, I was working with 8 different businesses in Ridgemont, and every single one was seeing dramatic improvements in both revenue and customer engagement. I wasn't charging them much. I was still thinking of this as a hobby rather than a business, but I was accumulating something much more valuable than money. I was building a reputation as someone who could see solutions that others missed. The breakthrough that would change everything came when I was working with Thomas Mitchell, who owned a small tech repair shop that was struggling to stay afloat as people increasingly replaced their devices rather than fixing them. Thomas was brilliant with technology but terrible at explaining what he did in terms that customers could understand. He was also sitting on a goldmine without realizing it. During one of our strategy sessions, Thomas mentioned that he had been experimenting with refurbishing older devices and selling them online as vintage tech to collectors and enthusiasts. He showed me some of the restored computers and gaming systems he'd been working on in his spare time, and I immediately saw the potential. "Thomas," I said, staring at a perfectly restored 1980s gaming console that he'd mentioned selling for $50, "do you realize that collectors are paying $500 for systems like this on auction sites?" He looked at me like I'd told him the moon was made of cheese. $500 for something that old? That afternoon, I spent 3 hours researching vintage technology markets, restoration communities, and collector trends. What I found was an entire ecosystem of people who were willing to pay premium prices for expertly restored vintage electronics, but who had no reliable source for high-quality restorations. I presented Thomas with a complete business plan that would transform his struggling repair shop into a specialized vintage technology restoration business. We would create an online presence that showcased his restoration process, build relationships with collectors and enthusiasts, and position him as the premier expert in vintage tech restoration in New England. "But I don't know anything about marketing or building websites," Thomas protested. "You don't need to," I replied. "That's what I do." What happened next exceeded both of our expectations. Within 3 months, Thomas had a waiting list of customers wanting vintage restorations. Within 6 months, he was shipping restored systems to collectors across the country. Within a year, he had hired 2 employees and was making more money than he had ever dreamed possible. But Thomas's success had an unexpected consequence that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Word of his transformation reached the attention of Mitchell & Associates, a business consulting firm in Hartford that specialized in helping small businesses scale up. They wanted to know who had orchestrated Thomas's remarkable turnaround. When they contacted me, I initially assumed they were just curious about my methods. But during our first meeting, the senior partner, Catherine Mitchell, made an observation that changed my entire perspective on what I had been doing. "Ms. Rivers," she said, reviewing the portfolio of businesses I had helped over the past year, "you realize that what you've accomplished here represents several $1 million in combined business value creation? You've essentially built a consulting practice that rivals firms that have been operating for decades." I stared at her, confused. "I was just helping some local businesses." Catherine smiled. "You were solving complex business problems that companies pay consulting firms hundreds of thousands of dollars to address. And your success rate is remarkable. Every business you've worked with has seen significant growth. That's not luck. That's extraordinary business intelligence." She leaned forward across the conference table. "Have you ever considered that what you're doing could be scaled up? That instead of helping one business at a time, you could help hundreds?" That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something I never could have imagined. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about Catherine's words. I began researching business consulting firms, digital marketing agencies, and companies that specialized in small business development. What I discovered was that there was a massive gap in the market, thousands of small businesses that needed exactly the kind of help I had been providing, but couldn't afford the high fees that traditional consulting firms charged. I started developing what I privately called the Rivers Method, a systematic approach to analyzing small businesses, identifying their unique value propositions, and creating customized growth strategies that leverage digital tools and storytelling to build authentic connections with customers. But I kept this research and planning completely separate from my life as Derek's wife. During family dinners, I smiled and nodded while Constance discussed charity galas and social obligations. During Derek's business events, I played the role of the supportive spouse who asked polite questions and remembered everyone's names. I had learned to compartmentalize my 2 worlds so completely that sometimes I felt like I was living as 2 different people. Derek occasionally asked about my little projects with local businesses, but he viewed them as harmless hobbies that kept me busy while he focused on real business matters. The Ashworth family had made it clear that my role was to eventually produce the next generation of Ashworths, while serving as an attractive and well-behaved accessory at social functions. What none of them realized was that while I was learning to navigate their world of appearances and expectations, I was also building something that would soon dwarf everything they had achieved across 3 generations of Ashworth's success. The turning point came when I received an email from a business development company in New York that had heard about my work through Catherine Mitchell. They were interested in discussing a potential partnership that could help me reach small businesses across the entire Northeast region. As I read that email, sitting in the guest house surrounded by Derek's family antiques, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue playing the role of the grateful small-town girl who had married up, or I could step into the role of the business innovator I had always been meant to be. I chose to respond to that email, and with that single decision, I set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately give me the power to smile when Derek called me worthless, because I would know exactly what I was truly worth. The email from New York led to a phone call that would change my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. The business development company, Meridian Growth Partners, specialized in scaling successful local consultants into national brands. They had been tracking my work through industry connections and were interested in discussing what they called a strategic partnership opportunity. During that first phone conversation with their senior partner, Rebecca Sterling, I learned that several of my clients had been featured in business publications as success stories, and my name was starting to appear in consulting circles as someone who achieved impossible turnarounds with struggling small businesses. Rebecca explained that they were looking for consultants with proven track records who could be scaled up to serve their network of over 3,000 small businesses across the Northeast. What we're proposing, Rebecca said, is essentially creating a franchise model of your consulting approach. We provide the infrastructure, the client base, and the marketing support. You provide the methodology and oversee the quality control. Our projections suggest this could generate between $2 and $5 million in annual revenue within 18 months. I nearly dropped the phone. $2 to $5 million in a year and a half. But there was a complication I hadn't anticipated. To move forward with Meridian, I would need to formalize my consulting business, which meant registering a company, establishing business accounts, and making my work official rather than keeping it as a series of informal arrangements with local businesses. This was where the Ashworth family dynamics became significantly more complex. Derek's family operated under a very specific set of expectations about how members of their social circle should conduct themselves. Constance Ashworth had spent 40 years cultivating the family's reputation as pillars of the community, people who supported the right charities, attended the right events, and maintained the right kind of understated elegance that old money families prized above everything else. In Constance's world, wives of successful men had hobbies, not businesses. They might serve on charity boards or organize fundraising galas, but they didn't compete in the marketplace. They certainly didn't build companies that might overshadow their husband's achievements or draw attention away from the family name. I discovered this philosophy during what Constance liked to call her monthly guidance sessions, formal tea meetings, where she would review my progress in becoming a proper Ashworth wife and identify areas that needed improvement. These sessions took place in Constance's private sitting room, a perfectly appointed space filled with antique furniture and family portraits that seemed to stare down at me with disapproval. Constance would serve tea in delicate china cups that I was always terrified of breaking, and then proceed to dissect my behavior from the previous month with the precision of a skilled surgeon. "Amelia, darling," she began during the session where I finally worked up the courage to mention my consulting work, "I've been hearing some interesting stories about your little activities around town." The way she said little activities made it clear that she had already formed an opinion about what I was doing, and it wasn't a favorable one. "Several women at the country club have mentioned that you've been spending quite a bit of time with local shop owners," Constance continued, her voice carrying the kind of polite disapproval that made her statements feel like accusations. "While your desire to help the less fortunate is admirable, I'm concerned about how this might reflect on the family." I set down my teacup carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been helping some local businesses improve their operations. It's work I'm good at, and it's making a real difference in people's lives." Constance's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "Of course, dear. And I'm sure these people appreciate your charity. But you must understand that as Derek's wife, you represent more than just yourself. Every choice you make reflects on the Ashworth name." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone she might use to explain something to a particularly slow child. "The wives in our social circle don't engage in commercial activities, Amelia. It simply isn't done. It suggests a certain desperation that's inconsistent with our family's position." I felt my cheeks flush with anger, but I forced myself to remain calm. "With all due respect, Constance, this isn't charity work. I'm providing professional consulting services to businesses that need strategic guidance." "Professional consulting," Constance repeated, as if the words themselves were distasteful. "Darling, you're playing at business. These little shop owners are being polite to you because of your connection to our family, not because you have any real expertise. The dismissal was so complete, so condescending, that I felt like I'd been slapped. But what hurt most was the realization that this was how she had always seen me, as someone playing at being important, pretending to have value beyond my marriage to her son. Perhaps, Constance continued, it would be better if you focused your energies on more appropriate activities. The Ridgemont Historical Society is looking for new board members, and the Children's Hospital Fundraising Committee could use someone with your enthusiasm. I left that meeting feeling smaller than I had since arriving in Connecticut, but I also left with a crystal clear understanding of what I was up against. The Ashworth family wasn't just indifferent to my success, they were actively opposed to it because it didn't fit their narrative of who I was supposed to be. That evening, Derek reinforced his mother's message in his own way. He found me in our home office, working on a presentation for a potential new client, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lay. "Mom mentioned you had an interesting conversation today," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to comment on other people's choices. "She expressed some concerns about my consulting work," I replied carefully. Derek nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "You have to understand her perspective, Amelia. She's spent her entire adult life building our family's reputation in this community. When you're running around town playing business consultant, it sends mixed messages about our financial situation." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. Mixed messages about our financial situation? "People might think we need the money," Derek explained, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "They might assume that our finances are less stable than they appear." "Derek," I said slowly, "I'm not doing this for pocket money. The businesses I'm working with are seeing real growth, real success. This could become something significant." He laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was the sort of laugh that parents give when their children announce they want to be astronauts or professional athletes. "Sweetheart, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you have to be realistic. You're talking about small-town businesses that need help with their Facebook pages. That's not exactly Fortune 500 consulting." The condescension in his voice was so familiar that I realized this wasn't a new attitude. It was just the first time he'd been open about it. Derek had always seen my work as a harmless hobby that kept me busy and out of trouble. The idea that it might become something substantial, something that could stand on its own merit, had never occurred to him. "Besides," Derek continued, "we're planning to start a family soon. You're going to have plenty to keep you busy without worrying about other people's business problems." This was the first I'd heard about concrete family planning, but Derek mentioned it as if it was a decision that had already been made without my input. Just another example of how my role in the Ashworth family was seen as predetermined rather than negotiated. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation I'd had with Rebecca Sterling from Meridian Growth Partners. She had seen potential in my work that could translate into millions of dollars and genuine business success. Meanwhile, my husband and his family saw it as an embarrassing hobby that needed to be discouraged before it reflected poorly on their social standing. I realized that I had a fundamental choice to make. I could accept the Ashworth family's vision of my future: devoted wife, eventual mother, charitable volunteer, social ornament. Or I could pursue the business opportunity that Rebecca had presented. But I also realized that if I chose to move forward with Meridian, I would need to do it quietly. The Ashworth family's disapproval wasn't just about social expectations, it was about control. They needed me to remain dependent on them, both financially and socially, in order to maintain their power over my choices. So I made a decision that would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. I would pursue the Meridian partnership, but I would do it in secret. I would build my business empire quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to what I was accomplishing, until I was strong enough to withstand whatever opposition the Ashworth family might mount. What I didn't realize at the time was that Derek's sister Penelope had been watching my activities much more closely than I had suspected. Penelope Ashworth Blackstone lived for social intelligence, knowing who was doing what, when, and why. She collected information about people the way other people collected art, and she had been building a very detailed file on my inappropriate behavior for months. During the next family gathering, Penelope would share her observations with the rest of the Ashworth clan, setting in motion a series of events that would force me to accelerate my timeline and make choices I wasn't quite ready to make. But I would also discover that underestimation can be a powerful weapon when wielded by someone who knows exactly how much they're worth. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the Ashworth family's disapproval would escalate, from polite suggestions to active sabotage. It started with small things that I initially dismissed as coincidences or misunderstandings, but looking back I can see that it was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate me from my work and force me back into the role they had designated for me. The first incident happened during a business lunch I had scheduled with Patricia Coleman, who owned a struggling antique shop in downtown Ridgemont. Patricia had contacted me after hearing about my work with Francesca's Bistro, and she was hoping I could help her compete with the large antique chains that were drawing customers away from her family business. We had arranged to meet at the Ridgemont Country Club, which Derek had suggested would be more appropriate than meeting at Patricia's shop. I had been a member for 6 months by then, though I still felt like an imposter every time I walked through the imposing front doors with their brass nameplate listing founding families from the 1920s. I arrived early and was waiting in the elegant dining room when Constance appeared at my table, perfectly dressed as always, wearing an expression of concerned confusion. "Amelia, darling," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to attract attention from nearby tables. "I was so surprised to hear that you were meeting with Patricia Coleman here today." I felt my stomach tighten. "Yes, we're discussing some business matters." Constance sat down uninvited, her movement so smooth and natural that anyone watching would assume she had been expected. "Business matters," she repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. I wasn't aware that Patricia was in any position to conduct business these days." Before I could ask what she meant, Constance continued in the same concerned tone. Her financial difficulties have been quite the topic of conversation lately. "Poor thing has been struggling to keep that little shop afloat for months. I do hope she's not asking you for money, dear. People in desperate situations sometimes make inappropriate requests of those they perceive as having resources." The implication was clear. Patricia was targeting me because of my connection to the Ashworth family, not because of any professional expertise I might have. But worse was what came next. "Of course," Constance said, glancing around the dining room as if to ensure she wasn't overheard, "meeting here does give the impression that this is some sort of official business arrangement. I'm sure you didn't intend to suggest that you're operating as some kind of consultant, but appearances can be so easily misunderstood." When Patricia arrived 15 minutes later, she seemed nervous and apologetic in a way that confused me until I realized what had happened. Constance had somehow contacted her before our meeting and made it clear that conducting business at the country club was inappropriate, that my position as Derek's wife made it unseemly for me to engage in commercial activities, and that Patricia's request for help reflected poorly on both of us. The lunch that should have been a productive business discussion became an awkward social obligation, where Patricia spent most of the time reassuring me that she wasn't really in financial trouble and that she didn't really need professional help, just friendly advice. By the end of the meal, it was clear that she had been successfully intimidated out of working with me. That evening, Derek approached the incident with what I was beginning to recognize as his standard technique for managing family conflicts, acknowledging that something unfortunate had happened while making it clear that I was responsible for creating the situation. "Mom mentioned she ran into you and Patricia Coleman at the club today," he said over dinner, his tone carefully neutral. "She was concerned that there might have been some miscommunication about your role there." "There was no miscommunication," I replied. "I was meeting with a potential client to discuss consulting services." Derek set down his fork and looked at me with the patient expression he used when he thought I was being deliberately difficult. Amelia, you have to understand how this looks. The country club isn't a place for conducting commercial business. It's a social institution. Other members conduct business there all the time, I pointed out. Half the conversations I overhear are about deals and partnerships and investment opportunities. That's different, Derek said, as if the distinction was obvious. Those are established businessmen discussing matters related to their existing companies. What you're doing, it looks like you're soliciting clients. The word soliciting was chosen deliberately, carrying implications that made my professional activities sound desperate and somehow improper. I realized that Derek wasn't just embarrassed by my business work, he was actively working to undermine it. Over the following weeks, similar incidents multiplied. I would schedule meetings with potential clients only to receive last-minute cancellations with vague explanations about reconsidering their needs or deciding to handle things internally. Business owners who had initially seemed enthusiastic about working with me would suddenly become distant and evasive when I followed up on our conversations. It took me 3 weeks to figure out what was happening, and the discovery came through an unexpected source. Thomas Mitchell, whose vintage tech restoration business had become incredibly successful through our partnership, called me one evening with a warning. Amelia, he said, his voice low and concerned, I think you should know that someone has been making calls about you. My heart sank. What kind of calls? Questions about your qualifications, your background, whether the businesses you've worked with have really seen the kind of improvements you claim. The person identified themselves as conducting due diligence for a potential client, but something about it felt off. Thomas had received the call that afternoon. The caller had asked detailed questions about our working relationship, whether I had charged appropriate fees, and whether my involvement had actually contributed to his business success, or whether other factors might have been responsible for his growth. They also asked whether you had ever misrepresented your experience or made promises you couldn't keep, Thomas continued. The whole conversation felt like they were looking for ammunition against you rather than trying to verify your credentials. I felt a chill of realization. Someone was actively working to destroy my professional reputation, and they were doing it systematically and professionally. The caller had identified themselves as representing Ashworth Family Advisors, a name that could have been legitimate or could have been created specifically for this purpose. Either way, the message was clear. The Ashworth family was not content to simply disapprove of my business activities. They were actively working to sabotage them. That night, I confronted Derek directly. I waited until we were alone in our bedroom, away from any possibility of being overheard, and I asked him point-blank whether his family was interfering with my business relationships. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. Even before he said a word, he didn't look surprised or confused by my accusation. He looked guilty and defensive, like someone who had been caught doing something he knew was wrong but felt justified in doing anyway. Look, he said finally, running his hand through his hair in the gesture that I was beginning to associate with his discomfort. The family is concerned about you. We all are. Concerned about what exactly? About you getting in over your head with something you don't fully understand, Derek replied. These business owners, they're taking advantage of your good nature. They're letting you think you're helping them when really they're just being polite because of your connection to our family. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Derek, I've helped 8 different businesses significantly increase their revenue. Those aren't coincidences or politeness. Those are measurable results. Are they? Derek asked, and his tone suggested that he genuinely doubted my version of events. Or are these people telling you what you want to hear because they don't want to offend the wife of Derek Ashworth? I stared at him, realizing that he had never once asked to see the actual results of my work. He had never looked at the before and after revenue numbers, never reviewed the testimonials from satisfied clients, never shown any genuine interest in understanding what I was accomplishing. He had simply assumed that whatever I was doing couldn't be significant because I was the one doing it. You really believe that? I said, and it wasn't a question. You really believe that I'm so delusional that I can't tell the difference between real business success and people being polite to me. Derek's expression softened, as if he thought my hurt feelings were touching but misguided. Sweetheart, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect you from getting hurt by people who might take advantage of your generosity. But I was beginning to understand that Derek's protection looked exactly like sabotage, and his concern felt identical to control. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I received a call from Rebecca Sterling at Meridian Growth Partners. She was calling to inform me that they had been contacted by someone claiming to represent my interests, suggesting that I was no longer available for the partnership opportunity we had been discussing. The caller indicated that you had decided to focus on family obligations instead of pursuing business ventures, Rebecca explained. But something about the conversation seemed off to me, so I wanted to check with you directly. I felt my hands shake as I held the phone. Rebecca, I never authorized anyone to speak on my behalf. I'm absolutely still interested in the partnership. I thought as much, she replied. The caller couldn't provide specific details about your decision, and when I asked to speak with you directly, they became evasive. It felt like someone was trying to sabotage the opportunity. After that conversation, I finally understood the full scope of what I was facing. The Ashworth family wasn't just disapproving of my business activities. They were actively working to destroy them. They were making calls to my clients, spreading doubt about my qualifications, and even attempting to interfere with opportunities I hadn't told them about. They had declared war on my independence, and they were fighting it with weapons I was only beginning to understand: social pressure, reputation management, and the kind of behind-the-scenes influence that old money families wielded like a scalpel. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign against me. They had assumed that I would be broken by their attacks, that I would retreat back into the role they had assigned me, rather than fight back. What they didn't realize was that every attempt to undermine me only made me more determined to succeed. Every condescending comment, every sabotaged meeting, every whispered doubt about my capabilities was fuel for a fire that was about to burn much brighter than they could possibly imagine. I was done playing by their rules. I was done accepting their definition of my worth. And I was about to show them exactly what happened when they underestimated someone who had been quietly building an empire while they were busy trying to tear down her confidence. The discovery that my own family was actively sabotaging my business relationships forced me to make a decision that would fundamentally change how I approached everything. If the Ashworth family wanted to play games with my professional reputation, I would have to become much more strategic about protecting my work and building my future. I decided to accelerate my timeline with Meridian Growth Partners, but I would do it completely underground. No more meetings at the country club, no more casual mentions of my consulting work, no more trusting that Derek or his family would respect boundaries they had already proven they were willing to cross. Working with Rebecca Sterling, I established what we called a stealth development plan. Instead of operating under my married name, I would build the new consulting business under my maiden name, Rivers Strategic Solutions. All business communications would go through a secure email account and a post office box in Hartford, 30 minutes away from Ridgemont. I would conduct all client meetings and business calls from a small office space I rented under my maiden name, paying for everything through a business account that Derek had no knowledge of or access to. It was exhausting maintaining two completely separate lives, but it was also exhilarating. During the day, I played the role of the dutiful Ashworth wife, attending charity committee meetings and making polite conversation at social gatherings. But early in the mornings and late into the evenings, I was building something that exceeded my wildest expectations. Rivers Strategic Solutions launched quietly in October, and within 6 weeks, we had 12 clients across 3 states. The Meridian Partnership provided access to small businesses that were hungry for exactly the kind of transformation I had been creating in Ridgemont, but on a much larger scale. Rebecca's projections had been conservative. By December, we were on track to exceed $5 million in first-year revenue. But the success came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Managing multiple client relationships, developing standardized processes, and training other consultants to implement my methods required time and energy that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide from Derek and his family. The first real crisis came in November, when I was scheduled to present a case study about River's strategic solutions at a business conference in Boston. The presentation was crucial for establishing our credibility with larger potential clients, but it meant being away from Ridgemont for 2 days during a week when the Ashworth family had several social obligations. I told Derek that I was visiting my parents in Colorado, a lie that felt necessary but uncomfortable. My parents had always been honest, straightforward people, and maintaining deceptions went against everything they had taught me about integrity. But I also knew that revealing the truth about my business would result in escalated sabotage that could destroy everything I was building. The Boston conference exceeded every expectation. My presentation on scaling authentic business transformation was standing room only, and I fielded questions for 45 minutes afterward from business owners who wanted to understand how I achieved such consistent results with struggling companies. 3 major consulting firms approached me about potential acquisitions, and a business magazine requested an interview about my methodology. Flying back to Connecticut, I felt like I was living in 2 different universes. In one universe, I was Amelia Rivers, a successful business consultant whose work was attracting national attention and generating serious revenue. In the other universe, I was Mrs. Derek Ashworth, whose most important responsibility was choosing appropriate flower arrangements for the upcoming holiday charity gala. The collision between these 2 universes was inevitable, and it happened in the most devastating way possible. I returned from Boston on a Thursday evening to find Derek waiting for me in our living room with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more calculating. Sitting across from him was Penelope, Derek's sister, wearing the satisfied smile of someone who had just delivered particularly damaging information. "How was Colorado?" Derek asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Fine," I replied, setting down my travel bag and trying to read the tension in the room. "My parents send their regards." Penelope laughed, a sound that made my blood freeze. "That's interesting because I called your parents yesterday evening to ask about a recipe your mother had mentioned at our last family gathering. Imagine my surprise when she told me you weren't there and hadn't visited in over 3 months. The trap had been perfectly laid." I looked at Derek, whose expression confirmed that he now knew I had been lying to him, though he didn't yet know what I had been lying about. "Where were you, Amelia?" Derek asked, and his voice carried an edge that suggested he already suspected the answer. I could have continued lying. I could have invented an emergency with a college friend, or claimed I had decided to take a spa weekend instead of visiting family. But looking at their faces, Derek's cold disappointment and Penelope's triumphant satisfaction, I realized I was tired of living in secret, tired of apologizing for success, tired of pretending to be smaller than I was. "I was in Boston," I said quietly, "at a business conference." The silence that followed was loaded with significance. Derek's face went through several expressions: confusion, realization, and finally a kind of betrayed anger that suggested he felt personally attacked by my deception. "A business conference," he repeated slowly, "for your little consulting hobby." "It's not a hobby anymore, Derek," I said, and there was something liberating about finally saying it out loud. "It's a business, a successful business." Penelope leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of gossip that would fuel country club conversations for months. "How successful could it be? You're operating out of what? The guest bedroom?" I looked at her, remembering every condescending comment, every subtle insult, every attempt to make me feel grateful for their acceptance. And I decided that I was done protecting their feelings about my success. Successful enough that I was invited to speak at the Northeast Business Development Conference, About scaling strategic consulting practices, I said calmly. Successful enough that 3 major consulting firms have expressed interest in acquisition discussions. Successful enough that my business is projected to generate over $5 million in revenue this year. The number hung in the air like a bomb. Derek stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Penelope's mouth literally fell open. $5 million, Derek said finally. You're claiming that your little side project is worth $5 million. I'm not claiming anything, I replied. I'm stating a fact. Derek stood up abruptly, beginning to pace in the way he did when he was trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of the world. That's impossible, Amelia. You've been helping a few local shop owners with their marketing. You can't just multiply that by some random number and pretend it's a real business. I can show you the contracts, the client testimonials, the revenue reports, I offered. Everything is documented and verified. But Derek was shaking his head before I finished speaking. No, this is exactly what Mom was worried about. You've gotten caught up in some kind of fantasy where you think you're running a legitimate business, but it's not real. The dismissal was so complete, so automatic, that I realized Derek was psychologically incapable of accepting that I might have achieved something significant independently. His entire understanding of our relationship, of his family's superiority, of his own importance, depended on me remaining the grateful small-town girl who needed their guidance and support. Penelope, meanwhile, was already calculating the social implications. Amelia, you realize that if word gets out about this business venture, it's going to reflect very poorly on the family. People will think we're in financial trouble, that Derek can't support his wife properly. Or they might think that Derek married a woman with extraordinary business talent, I suggested. Penelope looked at me as if I had suggested that pigs might fly. Darling, no one is going to believe that. They're going to assume that either you're exaggerating your success or that something inappropriate is happening. What exactly are you implying, Penelope? She exchanged a look with Derek before answering. People might wonder how a small-town girl with no business education suddenly becomes so successful so quickly. They might question whether your clients are really paying for consulting services or whether other factors are involved. The implication was clear and insulting beyond measure. They were suggesting that my business success could only be explained by impropriety, that my clients must be paying for something other than professional expertise. Derek ran his hand through his hair, looking overwhelmed. This is a disaster, Amelia. You've been lying to me for months about where you're going and what you're doing. You've been using our family name to build some kind of business without discussing it with me. You've put our reputation at risk for what, a fantasy about being a successful consultant? I looked at my husband, at his sister, at the 2 people who should have been celebrating my success and instead were treating it like a scandal that needed to be covered up. I realized that this was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for since the day I moved to Connecticut. This was the moment when I would have to choose between the life they wanted me to live and the life I was capable of building for myself. Derek, I said quietly, if you truly believe that $5 million in projected revenue is a fantasy, if you honestly think that 3 major consulting firms would express acquisition interest in something that isn't real, then you don't know me at all. He stared at me, and I could see him struggling with information that challenged everything he believed about himself, about me, about the natural order of their world. Prove it, Penelope said suddenly. If this business is so successful, prove it. Show us the contracts, the bank statements, the documentation. I smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. Actually, Penelope, I don't think I will. Because whether or not you believe me is completely irrelevant to the reality of what I've built. That was the moment when Derek's expression changed from confusion to something much darker. That was the moment when I realized that the Ashworth family's campaign against my independence was about to escalate into something I hadn't prepared for. And that was the moment when I knew I needed to accelerate my exit strategy before they found a way to destroy everything I had worked so hard to create. The confrontation in our living room marked the end of any pretense that Derek and I were partners in our marriage. Over the following 3 weeks, he transformed from a dismissive husband into something much more dangerous. A man who felt his authority had been challenged and was determined to reassert control through any means necessary. Derek's first move was to demand complete transparency about my business activities. He wanted access to all my accounts, copies of all contracts, and detailed explanations of every client relationship. When I refused, citing client confidentiality and basic professional ethics, he accused me of hiding assets and threatened to involve his family's lawyers. "You're my wife," he said during one particularly heated argument. "Legally, what's yours is mine. I have a right to know about any business you're conducting under our roof." "Actually," I replied, "since River Strategic Solutions is registered under my maiden name and operates completely independently of any Ashworth family resources, you have no legal claim to information about it whatsoever." The fact that I had researched the legal implications and protected myself accordingly seemed to infuriate him more than anything else. Derek was accustomed to being the financial and legal expert in our relationship, and discovering that I had navigated complex business formations without his knowledge or approval undermined his sense of intellectual superiority. Constance, meanwhile, launched what she called a family intervention, designed to bring me back to my senses. She scheduled a series of meetings with what she termed appropriate role models, other wives in their social circle, who had found fulfilling ways to contribute to their communities without engaging in anything as unseemly as commerce. The most memorable of these interventions involved lunch with Vivian Blackstone, Penelope's mother-in-law, who had spent 30 years building what Constance described as the premier charitable foundation in New England. Vivian was supposed to show me how accomplished women channeled their energies into socially acceptable outlets. The lunch took place at the Ridgemont Garden Club, a setting chosen specifically to remind me of the social world I would be excluded from if I continued down my current path. Vivian spent an hour detailing her work with the Blackstone Foundation, which provided scholarships for underprivileged students and funded arts programs in urban schools. "The work is incredibly fulfilling," Vivian explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who genuinely believed in her contributions. "And it's made a real difference in hundreds of young lives over the years." I listened respectfully, genuinely impressed by the scope of what the foundation had accomplished. When she finished her presentation, she looked at me expectantly, clearly waiting for me to express envy or regret about my own choices. "That's remarkable work," I said sincerely. "How much has the foundation distributed in scholarships and grants over the past 30 years? Vivian's chest swelled with pride. "Just over $2 million. It's been the most rewarding project of my life." I nodded thoughtfully. "That's wonderful. River's Strategic Solutions will generate more than twice that amount in revenue this year alone, and we're helping struggling businesses create sustainable employment for hundreds of families across the Northeast." The silence that followed was profound. Vivian stared at me as if I had committed some sort of social blasphemy by comparing commercial success to charitable contribution. Constance's expression suggested that I had just confirmed her worst fears about my character. "Amelia," Constance said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger, "you're missing the point entirely. Vivian's work is about service, about giving back to the community. What you're describing is simply making money. What I'm describing is creating economic value that allows families to keep their businesses, their employees to keep their jobs, and their communities to remain viable," I replied. "I'm not sure how that's less valuable than writing checks from inherited wealth." I realized immediately that I had crossed a line. Mentioning inherited wealth was a direct attack on the source of the Ashworth family's power and social standing. It suggested that their charitable work was easy because they were redistributing money they hadn't earned, rather than creating value from nothing. The lunch ended with polite but frozen farewells, and I knew that Constance would report my ingratitude and inappropriate attitudes to Derek within hours. That evening, Derek was waiting for me with the kind of contained fury that scared me more than open anger. He had clearly been rehearsing what he wanted to say, and his words were calculated to inflict maximum damage. "Mom told me about your conversation with Vivian today," he began, his voice steady but cold. "Apparently, you've decided that making money is more important than serving others." "I've decided that creating economic value is a form of service," I replied. "I'm helping people save their businesses and their livelihoods." Derek laughed, but it was a harsh sound without any humor. "You're helping people with their Facebook pages, Amelia. Let's not pretend you're performing brain surgery." The dismissal was so automatic, so reflexive, that I realized Derek would never be capable of seeing my work as valuable, regardless of how successful it became. In his mind, anything I accomplished was automatically less important than anything he or his family did, simply because I was the one doing it. "Derek," I said quietly, "if you truly believe that what I do is so trivial, why are you so threatened by it?" His face flushed red. "I'm not threatened by anything. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that my wife thinks she's some kind of business genius, when she's actually just a small-town girl playing at being important." The words hit me like physical blows. This was what Derek really thought of me, what he had always thought of me. Everything else, the romance, the proposal, the promises about building a life together, had been based on his assumption that I would remain grateful and small and dependent on his family's approval. But the breaking point was still 2 weeks away, and it would come during the monthly Ashworth family dinner that I had been dreading since the confrontation about my business. This particular dinner was special, a celebration of the family's annual charitable contributions and a planning session for their holiday fundraising events. All the extended family would be there, along with several close friends who were major donors to their preferred causes. It was exactly the kind of event where my presence, as the inappropriately ambitious daughter-in-law, would be most uncomfortable for everyone involved. I knew that attending would be walking into a trap. I knew that Constance and Penelope had probably been planning how to use the evening to publicly humiliate me into submission. But I also knew that refusing to attend would be used as evidence of my selfishness and disloyalty to the family. So I prepared for the dinner like a general preparing for battle. I researched every guest who would be attending, reviewed the financial details of every charity they supported, and armed myself with facts about the economic impact of small business development that I could cite if challenged about the value of my work. What I didn't prepare for was the text message I would receive during cocktails, the message that would change everything and give me the strength to smile when Derek called me worthless in front of his entire family. The message came from Rebecca Sterling at Meridian Growth Partners, and it contained news that exceeded every projection we had made about River's strategic solutions. But more importantly, it contained an offer that would make the Ashworth family's money, their social connections, and their approval completely irrelevant to my future. As I read that message, standing in the corner of Constance's elegant living room while the Ashworth family and their friends discussed the appropriate ways for women to contribute to society, I realized that everything was about to change. They thought they were about to humiliate me into submission. They had no idea that they were about to set me free. The text message I received during cocktails was from Rebecca Sterling, and it contained 3 pieces of information that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in that elegant dining room. As I read it in the corner while Derek's Uncle Harrison pontificated about traditional family values to a circle of nodding socialites, I felt my heart rate accelerate with a mixture of excitement and strategic clarity. The first piece of information was that Goldman Sachs had approached Meridian Growth Partners about acquiring River's strategic solutions for $42 million. Not 42,000. $42 million. The second was that Forbes magazine wanted to feature me in their 40 under 40 inches list of the most innovative business leaders in America, specifically highlighting my methodology for democratizing business transformation for small enterprises. The third was that Harvard Business School had invited me to develop a case study about River strategic solutions that would be taught in their entrepreneurship program, with the possibility of a guest professorship position. I read the message 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, then I saved it and slipped my phone back into my purse. Looking around the room at Derek's family and their friends, all of whom were worth significantly less than what Goldman Sachs was offering for a business they didn't even know I owned, I felt something I had never experienced before, the absolute certainty of my own power. Constance called everyone to dinner with her usual theatrical elegance, and we moved into the formal dining room where place cards had been arranged to ensure maximum social hierarchy. I was seated between Derek's elderly Aunt Millicent, who was deaf in one ear and considered me a curiosity, and Harrison's business partner Robert Whitman, who had made it clear on previous occasions that he found my presence at family gatherings inappropriate. The dinner conversation flowed predictably through topics designed to showcase the family's cultural sophistication and social awareness. Derek's cousin Bradley discussed his recent appointment to the board of the Metropolitan Opera. Penelope detailed her committee work for the upcoming charity winter ball. Harrison shared insights from his recent meeting with the governor about economic development initiatives. I participated minimally, offering polite comments when directly addressed, but mostly observing the performance of inherited privilege that I had watched dozens of times before. What was different this time was my perspective. Instead of feeling intimidated or excluded, I found myself analyzing their conversation as a business consultant might, noting the lack of actual innovation or value creation in anything they discussed. The turning point came when Robert Whitman, emboldened by wine and his position as an honored guest, decided to address what he clearly viewed as the elephant in the room, my recent business activities that had become a source of family embarrassment. "Constance," he said during a lull in conversation, "I've been hearing interesting stories about entrepreneurial ventures in the family. How wonderful that you're encouraging Amelia's creative outlets." The phrasing was masterful, acknowledging my business work while simultaneously diminishing it as a creative outlet rather than a serious enterprise. Constance's response was equally calculated. "Oh, yes," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Amelia has been quite busy helping some of our local shop owners with their little marketing challenges. It's been a lovely way for her to feel useful while she adjusts to life in Ridgemont." The condescension was so thick it was almost physical. Little marketing challenges, feel useful, adjusts to life. Every phrase was designed to minimize both the scope of my work and my capacity for independent achievement. Derek, who had been drinking steadily since cocktails, decided this was the perfect moment to elaborate on his mother's theme. "It's actually been quite educational for Amelia," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he used when explaining simple concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. "She's learning about the real world of business, seeing how challenging it actually is to run a successful enterprise." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever Derek spoke about my work as if it were a child's game rather than a professional endeavor. But this time, instead of the usual hurt and frustration, I felt something different: pity. Pity for a man who was so limited by his own assumptions that he couldn't recognize extraordinary success even when it was sitting at his dinner table. Harrison's wife Margaret decided to join the conversation with what she clearly thought was supportive commentary. "I think it's wonderful that Amelia is learning about business from the ground up. There's so much value in understanding how difficult it is for people without resources to succeed." "Exactly," agreed Penelope, warming to the theme. "It really gives you perspective on how fortunate we are to have established businesses and family connections. Most people struggle so much just to make ends meet." I realized they were having an entire conversation about poverty and small business challenges while sitting in a dining room that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Eating food prepared by staff they paid less in a year than they spent on wine. But more importantly, they were doing it while completely ignoring the fact that someone at their table had actually solved many of those challenges they were discussing so theoretically. Bradley decided to offer what he considered practical wisdom. The thing is, Amelia, small businesses fail at such high rates because most people simply don't have the skills or knowledge necessary to compete in today's market. That's why established companies with proper resources tend to dominate their sectors. It's not really about intelligence, added Robert, his tone suggesting he was being generous in his assessment. It's about access to capital, understanding of markets, and frankly, the kind of connections that take generations to build. They were essentially arguing that success in business required either inherited advantages or exceptional circumstances, the exact opposite of what my work had proven was possible. They were also doing it while looking directly at someone who had created millions of dollars in value, starting with nothing but knowledge and determination. Derek, encouraged by the supportive murmurs around the table, decided to drive the point home. That's what's been so interesting about Amelia's little project. She's discovering firsthand how much more complicated real business is than she initially thought. Little project. There it was again, the automatic diminishment that Derek applied to anything I accomplished. But this time, instead of feeling diminished, I felt something crystallizing inside me. A cold, clear understanding of exactly who these people were and what they represented. Constance, sensing that the conversation was achieving its intended effect of putting me in my place, decided to offer what she considered gracious encouragement. Of course, there's tremendous value in volunteer work, even if it doesn't generate significant financial returns. The important thing is that Amelia feels she's contributing something meaningful. Volunteer work doesn't generate significant financial returns. Feels she's contributing. The language was precisely chosen to strip away any possibility that what I was doing could be considered serious or substantial. I looked around the table at these people who had spent the evening dismissing my achievements while celebrating their own inherited advantages, and I realized that this was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for since the day I moved to Connecticut. This was the moment when I would either accept their definition of my worth or demonstrate my actual value in terms they could understand. Derek, perhaps sensing that he hadn't been sufficiently clear about his position, decided to eliminate any remaining ambiguity about how he viewed my business activities. The truth is, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a final verdict, Amelia's been playing at being a businesswoman, but she's fundamentally misunderstood what real success looks like. She's been working with people who have no real resources, no significant potential, no meaningful impact on the broader economy. It's essentially charity work disguised as consulting. He paused, taking a sip of wine before delivering what he clearly intended to be the definitive assessment of my capabilities and achievements. At the end of the day, these little local businesses she's been helping are worthless. And honestly, so is the work she's been doing with them. Worthless. The word hung in the air like a physical thing, and I felt something shift fundamentally in my understanding of my marriage, my relationship with Derek's family, and my own future. But instead of the crushing humiliation Derek had intended to inflict, I felt something entirely different: liberation. Because Derek had just called worthless a business that Goldman Sachs wanted to buy for $42 million. He had just dismissed as meaningless work that Harvard Business School wanted to study and teach. He had just declared insignificant achievements that Forbes magazine considered worthy of national recognition. And as I sat there, watching Derek's satisfied expression as he waited for me to absorb the impact of his judgment, I smiled. I smiled because I was about to show him exactly how wrong he was about everything. The smile that crossed my face when Derek called my work worthless was not the reaction anyone at that table expected. They had orchestrated this entire evening to break me down, to force me to acknowledge my place in their hierarchy, to make me grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they might offer. What they got instead was a woman who had just realized she held cards they didn't even know existed. I set down my wine glass with deliberate precision and looked directly at Derek. Worthless, I repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the word for the first time. That's interesting terminology. The confidence in my voice seemed to catch everyone off guard. Derek's expression shifted from satisfaction to uncertainty. Constance's perfectly composed facade flickered with concern. The rest of the table fell silent, sensing that something was happening but not understanding what. "Derek," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "I'm curious about your definition of worthless, because I just received some information that might complicate that assessment." I reached into my purse and retrieved my phone, moving with the kind of calm deliberation that comes from absolute certainty. You see, while you've all been discussing the challenges facing small businesses and the impossibility of creating value without inherited advantages, I've been receiving some rather extraordinary news about my worthless work. Derek leaned forward, his expression now openly wary. "Amelia, what are you talking about?" Instead of answering him directly, I addressed the entire table. "How many of you would consider Goldman Sachs to be a reputable judge of business value?" The question hung in the air. Goldman Sachs was exactly the kind of institution that the Ashworth family and their social circle revered. Old, established, serious, the epitome of legitimate financial power. "I think we'd all agree that Goldman Sachs doesn't waste time on worthless ventures," I continued, watching their faces carefully. "So I'm sure you'll be interested to know that they've just offered to acquire Rivers Strategic Solutions, my little consulting project, for $42 million. The silence that followed was profound and complete. It was as if I had announced that gravity had been reversed, or that the sun had decided to rise in the west. The number was so far outside their expectations that they seemed incapable of processing it. Harrison was the first to recover his voice. "42 million? That's impossible." "Is it?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "Why is it impossible, Harrison? Because I'm a woman? Because I didn't inherit the business? Because I started with nothing but intelligence and determination?" Robert Whitman, who had been so confident in his explanations about business failure rates, now looked like he was struggling to breathe. "You're saying that your local consulting work is worth $42 million? "I'm saying that Goldman Sachs believes it's worth $42 million, I corrected. "But that's not the only interesting development from this evening." I looked around the table, enjoying the way their certainty had crumbled in the face of information that didn't fit their worldview. Forbes magazine has invited me to be featured in their 40 Under 40 Feet list of the most innovative business leaders in America. They're particularly interested in what they call my, quote, democratization of business transformation. Penelope, who had spent years dropping names of people she'd met at charity events, now stared at me as if I had transformed into an alien species. Forbes magazine was exactly the kind of recognition that their social circle spent fortunes in public relations fees trying to achieve. "And," I continued, "Harvard Business School wants to develop a case study about Rivers Strategic Solutions for their entrepreneurship program. They've also mentioned the possibility of a guest professorship position." The words Harvard Business School had a physical impact on Derek. He sat back in his chair as if he'd been struck. Harvard represented everything the Ashworth family aspired to: academic prestige, intellectual authority, recognition from institutions that mattered. Constance, who had orchestrated this dinner to humiliate me, now looked like she was attending her own funeral. This is some kind of misunderstanding," she said weakly. "These organizations they don't contact people randomly." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "They don't contact people randomly. They contact people who have achieved something extraordinary. They contact people who have created genuine value in the marketplace. They contact people whose work has demonstrated measurable impact on hundreds of businesses and thousands of jobs." I stood up from the table, feeling the power of the moment wash over me. For 3 years, I had sat at this table feeling small, apologetic, grateful for whatever acceptance they offered. Now I was standing as an equal, no, as their superior, in every metric that actually mattered. "Derek," I said, looking directly at my husband, You called my work worthless. You said I was playing at being a businesswoman. You suggested that I was fundamentally confused about what real success looks like. Derek's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to form words. So let me clarify something for you, I continued. Rivers Strategic Solutions has generated over $5 million in revenue this year. We've helped 63 businesses across 7 states not just survive, but thrive. We've preserved over 400 jobs and created nearly 200 new ones. We've proven that small businesses can compete and win when they receive proper strategic guidance. I turned to address the entire table. You've spent this evening explaining to me why success in business requires inherited advantages, family connections, and generational wealth. But what you've actually demonstrated is how limited your understanding of real value creation actually is. Bradley, who had been so confident about the dominance of established companies, now looked like he was experiencing a mental breakdown. But how did you? We never heard anything about. Of course you didn't hear about it, I replied, because you weren't listening. You were so convinced of your own superiority that you never bothered to ask serious questions about what I was actually accomplishing. You assumed that because I didn't come from your world, I couldn't possibly create anything of value within it. I walked around the table slowly, letting my words sink in. You know what's truly remarkable about this evening? You spent hours discussing the challenges facing small businesses and the importance of economic development, but when someone at your own table was actually solving those problems, you dismissed it as charity work. Constance finally found her voice, though it was much weaker than her usual commanding tone. Amelia, if this is all true, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you share this success with the family? I looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Constance, I tried to tell you, multiple times, but every attempt to discuss my work was met with condescension, sabotage, or outright dismissal. You made it clear that you were more interested in controlling my activities than celebrating my achievements. Derek suddenly seemed to realize the implications of what I was revealing. Wait, he said, his voice cracking slightly. If Goldman Sachs is offering $42 million, what does that mean for us? For us? I repeated. Derek, there is no us in this equation. Rivers Strategic Solutions belongs entirely to me. It was built with my expertise, my time, my vision, and my resources. You contributed nothing to it except obstacles. The reality was finally beginning to penetrate their shock. I wasn't just successful. I was successful enough to be completely independent of them. I didn't need their money, their connections, or their approval. In fact, I had more money than most of them, more recognition than any of them, and more genuine power than they had ever wielded. Furthermore, I continued, since Derek seems so concerned about financial transparency, let me clarify our household economics. I've been supporting our lifestyle for the past year through my business earnings. The renovations to the guest house, the new furniture, even Derek's recent car purchase, all funded by my worthless consulting work. Derek's face went through several expressions as he processed this information. He had been living off the success of a business he had mocked and undermined, supported by a woman he had systematically tried to diminish. Robert Whitman, who had been so confident about the importance of family connections, made one last attempt to salvage their worldview. But surely this success, it's partially due to your connection to the Ashworth family name. I laughed, and it was genuine laughter, the kind that comes from truly appreciating irony. Robert, Rivers Strategic Solutions operates under my maiden name. My clients have no idea I'm married to Derek Ashworth, and if they did, it would likely damage my credibility rather than enhance it. Everything I've accomplished has been achieved despite my connection to this family, not because of it. I moved toward the door, then turned back for one final observation. You know what the most interesting part of this evening has been? Watching all of you discuss economic development and small business challenges as if they were abstract concepts, when someone sitting at your table had actually solved many of those problems. You were so invested in your assumptions about who could create value and how that you missed extraordinary success happening right in front of you. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the table full of people who had spent years making me feel small and insignificant. Derek, when you called my work worthless, you revealed more about your character than mine. A man who calls $42 million worthless is a man who fundamentally doesn't understand value. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear the eruption of voices behind me: confusion, recrimination, desperate attempts to process information that challenged everything they believed about themselves and their world. But I didn't look back. I had finally shown them exactly who they had been underestimating, and it felt even better than I had imagined it would. Walking out of the Ashworth mansion that night, I felt like I was breathing freely for the first time in 3 years. The cool Connecticut air felt crisp against my skin as I got into my car, a modest sedan that I now realized was a choice rather than a limitation. I could have been driving anything I wanted, but I had been so conditioned to hide my success that I had hidden it even from myself. The silence of the car as I drove back to the guest house was profound. No more pretending, no more diminishing myself, no more accepting their version of my worth. But as the adrenaline of the evening began to fade, I also began to understand that what I had just done would have consequences that extended far beyond a single dinner party. I had declared war on the Ashworth family's entire worldview, and they would not accept defeat gracefully. The first salvo came at 6:30 the next morning. Derek burst through the bedroom door without knocking, his hair disheveled, and his eyes red with what I assumed was a combination of sleepless night and continued drinking. "We need to talk," he announced, as if the previous evening hadn't already covered everything that needed to be said between us. I was sitting at the small desk in our bedroom, reviewing contracts that Rebecca Sterling had sent over for the Goldman Sachs acquisition discussions. The irony of Derek interrupting my work on a $42 million deal to have another conversation about my unrealistic expectations was not lost on me. "Good morning, Derek," I said calmly. "I assume you've had time to process yesterday evening's revelations." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair in the gesture that I now recognized as his response to situations he couldn't control. "Amelia, this is insane. This whole situation is completely insane." "Which part specifically?" I asked. "The part where I built a successful business, or the part where you called it worthless?" Derek stood up abruptly and began pacing, his agitation obvious. "You can't be serious about this Forbes thing, about Harvard, about any of it. These institutions they don't contact people like you." "People like me," I repeated. "What exactly does that mean, Derek?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression that was part pleading, part accusation. "You know what I mean. You're not from this world. You don't have the background, the connections, the pedigree that these organizations look for." It was fascinating to watch Derek struggle with information that challenged his fundamental beliefs about how success worked. In his mind, prestigious institutions only recognized people who came from prestigious backgrounds. The idea that they might actually care about merit, innovation, or measurable results was apparently inconceivable to him. "Derek," I said gently, "what if everything you believe about success is wrong? What if merit actually matters more than pedigree? What if creating value is more important than inheriting it?" His reaction was immediate and visceral. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't try to make this about my family's success. We've built something real, something lasting. We've contributed to this community for generations." "By doing what, exactly?" I asked. "Your family's textile business hasn't innovated in 20 years. You've essentially been managing a decline while living off investments your grandfather made. What value have you personally created, Derek?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Derek had spent his entire life defining himself in relation to his family's historical achievements, never questioning whether he had actually contributed anything meaningful to their legacy. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Derek's phone ringing. He answered it with obvious relief, grateful for the distraction from questions he couldn't answer. "Hello, Mother," he said, and I immediately understood that Constance had spent the night developing a strategy for managing the crisis I had created. I could hear Constance's voice through the phone, sharp and urgent. Derek's responses were mostly yes, and I understand, and we'll handle it. When he hung up, his expression had shifted from confusion to something more dangerous. Determination. "Mother has spoken to the family lawyers," he announced. "There are questions about the legal implications of what you've been doing." I felt a chill of recognition. The Ashworth family was moving beyond personal confrontation into legal warfare. "What kind of questions, Derek?" "Questions about whether you've been using our family name and connections to build your business. Questions about whether assets developed during our marriage belong to both of us. Questions about whether you've been hiding community property." The accusations were carefully chosen. Even though River Strategic Solutions operated under my maiden name and had been built entirely independently, the Ashworth family was going to argue that my marriage to Derek had somehow contributed to my success. They were going to claim ownership of achievements they had actively tried to sabotage. "Derek," I said carefully, "River Strategic Solutions was registered in my maiden name, operates completely independently of any Ashworth family resources, and was built using my own expertise and connections developed before our marriage. You have no legal claim to any part of it." But Derek was shaking his head before I finished speaking. "That's not how marriage works, Amelia. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. If you've been hiding assets, if you've been conducting business without my knowledge—" "Without your knowledge?" I interrupted. "Derek, I've tried to discuss my work with you dozens of times. You're the one who dismissed it as a hobby, who told me to focus on more appropriate activities, who actively sabotaged my client relationships." Derek's expression darkened. "I was trying to protect you from making a fool of yourself. I was trying to save you from embarrassment when these fantasies collapsed." It was remarkable how quickly Derek had rewritten history in his own mind. What had been condescension and sabotage yesterday was now protective concern. What had been dismissal and mockery was now wise guidance that I had foolishly ignored. "The lawyers want documentation," Derek continued. "They want to see contracts, bank statements, client lists. They want to understand exactly how this business was built and who it really belongs to." I stood up from the desk, feeling the same cold clarity I had experienced at dinner the night before. "Derek, let me make something very clear to you. River Strategic Solutions belongs entirely to me. I built it, I own it, and I control it. If your family wants to wage a legal battle over that, I welcome the challenge." Derek looked surprised by my confidence. "Amelia, you don't understand what you're up against. My family has resources, connections, legal expertise that you can't match." I smiled, remembering how often I had heard variations of this threat over the past 3 years. "Derek, your family's resources are exactly what I built my business to replace. Their connections are to a world that's becoming increasingly irrelevant. And their legal expertise is about to encounter something they've never dealt with before, a woman who actually understands her own worth." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of cars pulling into the driveway. Through the bedroom window, I could see 2 black sedans and what appeared to be a courier van. The Ashworth family cavalry had arrived. Derek looked out the window and then back at me. "They're here to collect documentation about your business activities. Mother thought it would be better to handle this quickly and quietly." I looked at my husband, this man I had loved, married, and tried to build a life with, and realized that he had just participated in planning what amounted to a raid on my personal and professional privacy. He had chosen his family's version of reality over the evidence of my success. "Derek," I said quietly, "they're welcome to try." But what they're going to discover is that I'm not the same woman who moved to Connecticut 3 years ago. I'm not grateful for their acceptance anymore. I'm not afraid of their disapproval. And I'm certainly not intimidated by their threats. I walked to the bedroom door, then turned back to face him one last time. You called my work worthless last night. By the end of today, you're going to understand exactly how much that worthless work is going to cost you. As I headed downstairs to meet whatever legal and social warfare the Ashworth family had planned, I felt the same certainty that had carried me through the previous evening's confrontation. They thought they were dealing with the small-town girl who had been grateful for their acceptance. What they were actually facing was a businesswoman who had built an empire in secret and was finally ready to stop hiding her power. The battle for my independence was about to begin in earnest, but for the first time since arriving in Connecticut, I was fighting from a position of strength. What the Ashworth family hadn't anticipated when they sent their legal team to collect documentation about my business was that I had been preparing for exactly this scenario for months. Not because I had expected Derek to betray me so completely, but because successful business owners always prepare for worst-case scenarios. I met the legal delegation in the guest house living room, 2 lawyers from the family's firm, Constance herself, and a forensic accountant whose presence suggested they were planning to challenge not just my ownership of Rivers Strategic Solutions, but the legitimacy of every financial transaction I had ever made. Gentlemen, Constance, I said, settling into the chair across from them with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you're about to surprise people who think they have all the advantages. I understand you have some questions about my business activities. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Charles Pemberton, who had clearly been handling Ashworth family legal matters for decades, opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Ashworth, we're here to discuss some irregularities that have come to the family's attention regarding undisclosed business activities conducted during your marriage. Irregularities, I repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting way to describe building a successful consulting business. What specific irregularities are you concerned about, Mr. Pemberton? Pemberton exchanged a glance with Constance before responding. We have reason to believe that you've been conducting commercial activities using resources, connections, and advantages gained through your marriage to Derek Ashworth, while failing to disclose these activities as community property. It was a carefully constructed accusation, designed to make my success sound like a form of theft rather than achievement. The implication was that anything I had accomplished must somehow belong partially to Derek because I had accomplished it while married to him. I see, I said, reaching for a folder I had prepared specifically for this moment. Well, since you're interested in documentation, let me provide some clarity about how Rivers Strategic Solutions was actually built. I opened the folder and spread out several documents across the coffee table. This is the business registration for Rivers Strategic Solutions, filed under my maiden name 6 months ago. This is the bank account, opened with my personal funds and operating entirely independently of any Ashworth family accounts. These are the contracts with Meridian Growth Partners, signed by me as the sole owner of the business. Pemberton leaned forward to examine the documents, his expression shifting from confidence to concern as he realized that everything was properly documented and legally bulletproof. Furthermore, I continued, since you seem interested in the resources and connections that built this business, let me walk you through exactly how that happened. I pulled out another set of documents. These are testimonials from my clients, detailing how I helped their businesses and what results were achieved. You'll notice that none of them mention any connection to the Ashworth family, because none of them know I'm married to Derek. The forensic accountant, a woman named Linda Hartwell, spoke for the first time. Mrs. Ashworth, even if the business operates under your maiden name, any income generated during the marriage would typically be considered community property. That's an excellent point, Ms. Hartwell, I replied, which brings me to something I think you'll find very interesting. I pulled out the final set of documents from my folder. These are the financial records for Derek and my household expenses over the past 18 months. You'll notice that I've been paying approximately 70% of our living costs, including Derek's car payment, the renovation of this guest house, and most of our social expenses." The silence that followed was profound. Constance's face had gone pale as she began to understand the implications of what I was revealing. "You see," I continued, "far from hiding community property, I've actually been subsidizing Derek's lifestyle with income from my business. If we want to discuss financial irregularities, we might start with the fact that Derek has been living off the success of a business he's been actively trying to sabotage." Pemberton was now studying the financial records with growing alarm. "These figures. Mrs. Ashworth, are you saying that your consulting business has been supporting the household?" "I'm saying that Rivers Strategic Solutions generated enough revenue to cover not just my own expenses but most of Derek's as well," I replied. "The business that you're trying to claim partial ownership of has actually been funding his ability to maintain the lifestyle he inherited rather than earned." Constance finally found her voice, though it was much weaker than her usual commanding tone. This is not what we understood the situation to be." "No," I agreed, "because none of you ever bothered to ask serious questions about what I was actually accomplishing. You were so convinced that success could only come from inherited advantages that you missed extraordinary achievement happening right in front of you." The second lawyer, who had been silent until now, decided to try a different approach. "Mrs. Ashworth, even if the financial aspects are as you describe, surely you understand that the Ashworth family name and social connections have contributed to your business success in ways that might not be immediately obvious." I smiled because this was exactly the argument I had been expecting. "That's an interesting theory, Mr. Davidson," he replied. "Richard Davidson. Mr. Davidson, let me ask you a question. If the Ashworth family name and social connections were so valuable to my business success, why has Derek spent the past year trying to convince me to stop working? Why has Constance been sabotaging my client relationships? Why has this family done everything possible to undermine and discredit my professional activities?" Davidson opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to reconcile the family's hostile actions with their claim that they had somehow contributed to my success. "The truth is," I continued, "the Ashworth family name would actually damage my credibility with my clients, not enhance it. The businesses I work with are struggling enterprises, run by people who have worked for everything they've achieved. The last thing they want is advice from someone they perceive as privileged and out of touch." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds of the Ashworth estate. "You know what's remarkable about this conversation? You're sitting here trying to claim ownership of a business that you've spent months trying to destroy. You're arguing that your contributions made my success possible, when your actual contributions were obstacles I had to overcome." Turning back to face them, I delivered what I knew would be the decisive blow. "But perhaps most importantly, you're having this conversation while apparently unaware that Goldman Sachs has offered to acquire Rivers Strategic Solutions for $42 million. The impact was immediate and devastating. Pemberton actually dropped the document he was holding. Constance made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. Even the forensic accountant looked stunned. $42 million, I repeated slowly, for a business that Derek called worthless less than 24 hours ago. For work that Constance described as charity. For achievements that this family has spent months trying to discredit and sabotage. I returned to my chair and gathered up the documents I had spread across the table. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to proceed with the Goldman Sachs discussions, and I'm going to accept their offer. I'm going to take the Harvard Business School position they've offered. I'm going to be featured in Forbes magazine as one of the most innovative business leaders in America." Standing up again, I looked directly at Constance. "And I'm going to do all of this while filing for divorce from Derek, who has proven that he is fundamentally incapable of recognizing value, supporting achievement, or respecting the woman he married." Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps we should discuss the terms of any potential separation agreement." "Mr. Pemberton," I interrupted, The only terms I'm interested in discussing are how quickly Derek can find somewhere else to live. Because this guest house, like everything else he's been enjoying for the past year, was paid for with income from my worthless business. I walked to the door and held it open. Gentlemen, Constance, thank you for this illuminating conversation. You've helped me understand exactly how much courage it took to build something extraordinary, while surrounded by people who couldn't see it, wouldn't support it, and ultimately tried to claim credit for it. As they filed out, Constance stopped in front of me. Amelia, she said quietly, I think perhaps I, misjudged the situation. I looked at this woman who had spent 3 years trying to diminish me, who had sabotaged my business relationships and questioned my worth at every opportunity. Constance, you didn't misjudge the situation. You revealed exactly who you are when you encounter someone whose success doesn't fit your expectations. After they left, I sat alone in the guest house that I had unknowingly purchased with my own money, in the marriage I had unknowingly funded with my own success, surrounded by the life I had unknowingly built while being told I was worthless. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could see clearly, and what I saw was a future that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I stood in my new office at Harvard Business School, looking out at the campus where some of the world's brightest minds came to learn about business innovation and entrepreneurship. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now teaching case studies about building value from nothing to students who, in many cases, came from backgrounds not unlike the Ashworth family. The Goldman Sachs acquisition had closed 3 weeks earlier, $42 million, just as Rebecca Sterling had promised. After taxes and the settlement of various business obligations, I walked away with enough money to be completely independent for the rest of my life. But more importantly, I walked away with something I had never had before: absolute certainty about my own worth. The divorce from Derek had been finalized without drama. Once he understood that challenging me meant challenging a business worth more than his family's entire estate, he became remarkably cooperative about the separation terms. I kept everything I had built. He kept everything he had inherited. The division was clean, fair, and final. I had bought a townhouse in Cambridge, within walking distance of the Harvard campus, and furnished it with pieces that reflected my own taste rather than anyone else's expectations. Every morning, I woke up in a space that was entirely my own, surrounded by reminders of achievements that no one could diminish or dismiss. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the ripple effects of my success on the broader business community. The case study Harvard developed about Rivers' strategic solutions had been featured in multiple business publications, and my methodology for democratizing business transformation was being taught at business schools across the country. Small business owners from around the world reached out to ask how they could apply similar strategies to their own challenges. I had become exactly what Derek's family claimed was impossible: a woman from a modest background who had created something significant, measurable, and lasting. My assistant knocked on my office door, interrupting my thoughts. "Professor Rivers, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." I smiled at the title. Professor Rivers. No longer Mrs. Ashworth, no longer defined by my relationship to someone else's achievements. Just Amelia Rivers, business innovator, Harvard professor, and author of what was already being called a revolutionary approach to small business development. "Send them in, please." To my surprise, the visitor was Thomas Mitchell, the tech repair shop owner whose vintage restoration business had been one of my first major successes in Ridgemont. He looked nervous but determined as he entered my office. "Thomas," I said warmly, gesturing for him to take a seat, "what brings you to Cambridge?" He settled into the chair across from my desk, holding a manila folder that appeared to contain business documents. "Amelia, I wanted to thank you in person for what you did for my business. But I also wanted to ask you something." Over the past 6 months, Thomas's vintage tech restoration company had grown beyond anything either of us had imagined. He now had 12 employees, a waiting list that stretched 6 months out, and collectors from around the world seeking his services. More importantly, he had discovered that he had a genuine gift for understanding and explaining technology history to people who appreciated craftsmanship and authenticity. "I've been thinking about our conversations," Thomas continued, "about how you helped me see potential I didn't even know existed. And I realized that there are probably hundreds of other people like me, people with skills and knowledge, who just don't know how to turn that into a business." He opened the folder and pulled out what appeared to be a business plan. "I want to start a program that teaches technical specialists how to identify market opportunities for their expertise. Not just vintage tech restoration, but all kinds of specialized knowledge that people don't realize has commercial value." I leaned forward, immediately interested. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had made River Strategic Solutions successful, recognizing that expertise existed in unexpected places and that the right business strategy could transform hidden knowledge into valuable enterprises. "Thomas, that's a brilliant concept. What kind of support are you looking for?" "I was hoping you might consider being an advisor," he said. "Not for the money. I know you have plenty of that now, but because you understand how to help people see possibilities they can't see themselves." The request touched something deep in me. This was why I had gotten into business consulting in the first place. Not for the financial rewards, though they had certainly been gratifying, but for the satisfaction of helping people discover their own potential. "I'd be honored to advise your program," I said, "but I have one condition." Thomas looked concerned. "What's that?" "I want you to name it the Rivers Mitchell Initiative for Independent Enterprise Development. Your vision, my methodology, equal partnership." His face broke into a grin that reminded me why I had enjoyed working with him so much. Thomas understood that success was more meaningful when it was shared with people who respected the work required to achieve it. As Thomas left my office with plans to develop a comprehensive proposal, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that dinner at the Ashworth estate. The woman who had sat quietly while Derek called her work worthless seemed like a different person now. Someone I remembered fondly but could barely recognize. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Sterling, who had remained a close friend and occasional business partner even after the Goldman Sachs acquisition. "Saw the Forbes article this morning. You look like someone who knows exactly what she's worth." The Forbes 40 Under 40 Inches feature had been published that week, with a photo of me in my Harvard office and a headline that read, "From small-town consultant to Harvard professor, how Amelia Rivers revolutionized small business development." The article detailed my journey from helping individual businesses in Colorado to building a company that Goldman Sachs considered worth $42 million. But what I appreciated most about the article was that it told the story honestly, including the challenges I had faced from people who couldn't imagine that success could come from unexpected sources. The journalist had interviewed several of my former clients, and their testimonials painted a picture of someone who had seen potential where others saw only problems. One quote from Francesca, the Italian restaurant owner who had been among my first successes in Ridgemont, particularly resonated with me. "Amelia didn't just help my business succeed. She helped me remember that I had something valuable to offer. That's a gift you can't put a price on." As evening approached, I prepared to leave the office for my townhouse in Cambridge. Walking across Harvard Yard, I thought about the girl from Cedar Falls, Colorado, who had accepted a scholarship to study business because her parents believed education was the path to a better life. They had been right, though the path had taken unexpected turns. I thought about the woman who had moved to Connecticut believing that love and good intentions would be enough to bridge the gap between different worlds. She had been naive, but her heart had been in the right place. And I thought about the person I had become, someone who understood that worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, that success doesn't require permission from those who inherit their advantages, and that the most valuable thing you can build is confidence in your own capabilities. The next morning, I would teach a class about entrepreneurial innovation to Harvard MBA students who paid more for their education than many people earned in a year. Some of them would come from backgrounds of privilege and assumption. Others would come from circumstances more like my own. What I would tell all of them was something I had learned through experience rather than textbooks, that the most dangerous thing you can do is let other people define your potential. That worth is created through work, not inherited through accident of birth. And that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to accept someone else's judgment about what you're capable of achieving. Because when Derek Ashworth called me worthless at that family dinner, he was revealing more about his limitations than mine. And when I smiled in response, I was acknowledging something I had always known but had forgotten in my eagerness to be accepted: that my value had never been up for debate. I was worth exactly what I decided I was worth. And that, as it turned out, was considerably more than Derek Ashworth could ever understand or afford. The girl from Cedar Falls had built an empire. The woman from Ridgemont had conquered Harvard Business School. And Professor Amelia Rivers was just getting started. After all, when you know what you're truly worth, there's no limit to what you can build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.